afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Jack Atwood podcast. Well, it might not be the afternoon for some of you, but it's 4:40 here in Salt Lake at the time I'm recording this. That's closer to evening. Either way, you are welcome at the Jack Atwood podcast. And just to give you a little teaser, this episode might be the most exciting and my favorite episode ever of the Jack Atwood podcast. And turns out it's a solo episode. I do not have a guest with me once again. So, like I said, we don't have a guest today. And this episode was actually voted for on the Patreon. So if you're a Patreon member, you'd know that we had a vote for my next solo episode topic. The options were the Lost City of Atlantis, Vatican City, the pyramids, and the discovery of the Ark of the Covenant. We had 25% of the votes go to the discovery of the Ark of the Covenant, and 75% of the votes go to the Lost City of Atlantis. So that is going to be the topic of this episode. And when I first thought of the Lost City of Atlantis, I thought it'd be a cool idea. I got an email on the podcast about it from one of our listeners, Ava Butler, and I just assumed that Plato just wrote about it, and I think we took the first sci-fi story too seriously. But as I did a lot more research, the Lost City of Atlantis has farther origins than just Plato's writings. So I think you'll get a lot of cool content in this episode. But the biggest question has been, is Atlantis real or just an ancient version of clickbait? Plato's writings were allegories, and they were like metaphors to explain his philosophical ideas of a lot of other things. I'm not that smart, evidently, but he was like a smart dude. And if you know anything about Socrates, a lot of what we know about Socrates, in fact, almost everything we know about Socrates came from Plato's writings. And most of his writings were dialogues and paraphrasing of conversations that display, like I said, philosophical ideas of his. Okay, undoubtedly most of you have heard of or have seen a movie, or there was a video game of it inside, or you've read about something that said anything about Atlantis. It's a very common theory, a very intriguing subject of the Lost City of Atlantis. And I'm just going to give a background of what Plato's writings says it is. So it was a powerful advanced civilization that he said was in the North Atlantic Ocean, but it sank into the sea by a catastrophic natural disaster in the middle of the night, or in a single day. In fact, I have a quote from the writings of Plato, which were Timaeus and Critias, Critias, Critias. Okay, so what Plato said that Critias said in his writings was, and I quote, "Let me begin by observing, first of all, that 9,000 was the sum of years which had elapsed since the war which was said to have taken place between those who dwelt outside of the pillars of Hercules, not Hercules, and all who dwelt within them. This war I'm going to describe of the combatants. On one side, the city of Athens was reported to have been the leader and to have fought out the war. The combatants, the strange word, on the other side were commanded by the kings of Atlantis, which were, as was saying, was the island greater than the extent than Libya and Asia, and when afterwards sunk by an earthquake, became an impassable barrier of mud to voyagers sailing from hence to any part of the ocean." Okay, it's hard to read ancient writings because their phrasing is weird, because it was translated from Greek and they somehow rhymed back then because this was all literature and poems. But the point is, in Plato's writings, he wrote about a large imperial city that was an island larger than Libya and Asia. That might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but it also took place over 9,000 years ago, is what Plato said. Now, one other thing that he stated was it was beyond the pillars of Heracles, which places it right in the North Atlantic. Now, the interesting thing he said was that Atlantis went to war with Athens. Now, if you know anything about anything, you would know Atlantis didn't come about or around until 508 BC. Now, if Atlantis was around 9,000 years ago, that's impossible. And another, I don't believe the Earth was 9,000 years old, even back then. It might be now, but definitely not back then. But I am getting ahead of myself, so let's just go over the most believed theories about Atlantis. The first one, which is the most believed, is that Plato made up Atlantis, and the whole idea of this large imperial power in the Atlantic Ocean just to explain a philosophical idea. I do not believe this theory because it is not correct based on other writings. Plato states in the writings of Timaeus and Critias that the writings came from a founding father of Athens who went to Egypt and met up with some priests. So, Plato evidently, according to his writings, his own writings, did not just make up this idea. And actually, Plato's writings weren't the only thing that said that this founding father of Athens went to Egypt. There was another writing, if I can find it. Okay, so the guy named Plutarch in the later AD years, in early AD, wrote a book called The Life of Solon, and Solon was the lawmaker and a potential Athenian statesman who went to Egypt to meet up with the priest. Now, going back to what I said earlier, the idea of Atlantis just being Plato's theory doesn't really make sense, because if we have other credible writings that say Solon went to Egypt and heard from priests about Atlantis, that doesn't really... There are other writings besides Plato's that say that Solon went to Egypt. So that's not technically true. Plato couldn't have just made up Atlantis. One of the other main ideas, which I also do not believe, is that aliens created Atlantis, a high-tech society. I do not believe aliens are real, frankly, so that just gets rid of that whole idea. But the only proof that I have that this cannot be a profitable theory is my belief that aliens don't exist. If they did, I would look into it, but like I said, I don't believe in aliens, so there's no possible way that aliens could have created or had any part in Atlantis. I'm sorry, but yeah, theory 2 cannot exist. So we know that Plato didn't just make up Atlantis for his theories of philosophical ideas, and we also know aliens couldn't have created the advanced civilization. One other theory is that Atlantis was real, and we are going to get into that one, and that's going to take up the most time. So let's go to the beginning. Like I said, the guy named Solon, who's a very smart man. He was one of the founding fathers and 7 main guys of Athens. Before Athens was founded, he visited Egypt and met up with some of the Egyptian leaders and some priests. Now, there was a priest named Sanchez of Ses. That sounds Spanish, but I promise it's not. Sanchez, the priest of the goddess, whose name was Neith, which was the father of the sun god Ra, which is a little bit more common. But I'm not up on all the Egyptian gods, okay? This Egyptian priest, Sanchez, told Solon about Atlantis, and he told him that 9,000 years ago, which we'll park there for a minute, like I said, the earth couldn't have been that old. So Sanchez and the Egyptian priests, if Atlantis was real, could have misconceived the time. Egypt has been known for misinterpreting lunar years with solar years. So this could mess everything up, but that's still a large gap. So since they didn't even have this thing in writing, that year could just be pulled out of nowhere. So that year is not a profitable date. We'll get into dates later. But he said that there was an ancient civilization that was power over many cities. He said that there was a very advanced civilization and large island that had control over many cities, but then was destroyed in a single night. And all this was basically what Critias said. Now, after Solon, which was also a poet, heard this story, he was like, that's cool, I'm going to put it in my poem. But he never got around to doing it. So instead, he passed down the story to his buddy and relative, whose name was Dropidas. Now, that's a cool name, but he is not a main character. Dropidas, in turn, told it to his son later, whose name was Critias the Elder. Now, Critias the Elder was the father of the guy named, wait for it, Critias the Younger. They were very created in the Greek days. And he had conversations with Socrates, and he ended up making it into Plato's book. Now, Plato wrote about Critias's story that his father's father told him, that Solon told him, that the priest told him. So, Plato's writings of Atlantis could have been twisted or turned, like they couldn't have gone to war with Athens. I think that Plato just put that in the story to relate it to the Greeks' way of understanding. So we got that out of the way. Atlantis did not go to war with Athens. And it couldn't have been 9,000 years ago, and that could have been a misconception of time. I'm going to need you to listen very closely. If you're doing something passive right now, like doing the dishes or cleaning your car or driving, I need you to pull over on the side of the road and think about this very hard, because what I'm about to say is going to be like explaining the song "I'm My Own Grandpa." So, Solon heard the story from an Egyptian priest. Solon was going to write a poem about it, but he never got around to it. So he told it to his relative, Dropidas. Now, Dropidas told it to his son, whose name was Critias the Elder. Critias the Elder told it to his son, which was Critias the Younger. Now, Critias the Younger was a character in the dialogue of the book written by Plato, which was Timaeus and Critias, which mainly covered the idea of Atlantis. Now, Plato got the idea of Atlantis ultimately the idea of Atlantis came from the Egyptian priest Sanchez. Now that we have the origins of Atlantis out of the way and the idea that Atlantis can be real, let's put everything together. Everything relies on where the Egyptian priest Sanchez of Sais got the idea of Atlantis, or got the story of Atlantis, because Sanchez of Sais told this story, but we have no writings of Atlantis, we have no Egyptian records of Atlantis, we have found no evidence of Atlantis anywhere that are credible. So this could most likely and maybe be a delusional story and myth made up by Sanchez of Sais and his fellow priests, because they were under, or I should say, assistants. That's a far-fetched thing to say. Another way of saying is that ancient Egyptian priests were responsible for interpreting and transmitting the myths and rituals, potentially adding their own interpretations or elaborations. So, Sanchez could have, quote-unquote, heard this story from the god of Neith, which, fun fact, Neith was the goddess of creation, wisdom, and war. Do those not sound like factors of Atlantis? War, going to war with Athens, wisdom. The Athenians or Atlantis had great wisdom because they were one of the most advanced civilizations, supposedly, like ever. And creation, catching their abilities to create such an advanced society. Now, Neith was a very well associated god with the other god, which was the god of Thoth. Now, he was the god of learning and intelligence, which also links to the significance of Atlantis. Now, I'm not saying I believe in the Egyptians' gods. I believe in the one true God. But if you put all these factors together, it is very likely that the priest Sanchez could have put this story together based on what he believed about his gods. These kind of myths were not uncommon in these days, and he could have most definitely made this story up, turned it into a myth, and told Salome. It's not the most exciting theory, but it's a very big possibility. One of the three, actually. So, number one, Sanchez made up the idea of Atlantis based on his gods. The second conclusion is that Sanchez could have misinterpreted the history of the Minoan civilization. Now, the Minoan civilization was a very advanced civilization that resided on the island of Crete. Now, Crete is between Italy and Egypt, and it's in the Mediterranean. Now, it's a fairly large island in 4500 BC. So that would be, not 1450 BC, the Minoan civilization was destroyed and practically demolished by a large earthquake and volcanic eruption. This volcano was in a far-off island named Thera. Now, the volcanic ash blew to the island of Crete and caused much fire demolition to the city. And earthquakes were also a factor that also caused much destruction to the city of Crete. So by 1450 BC, the Minoan civilization was practically all gone. This highly advanced civilization was just completely demolished by a natural disaster, which the eruption of the volcano on the island of Thera was 1 to 2 days long. Now, this could be clearly linked to the idea that Atlantis was destroyed in a single night. So the Egyptian priest and priests could have taken the story of the Minoan civilization and twisted it, because the Minoan civilization was a long time before Sanchez's time and a pretty far long away from Egypt. Now, if they took the story of the Minoan civilization, and twisted it, it could have easily become Atlantis. Between different interpretations and ideas, it's like playing a game of telephone. If you've ever played a game like this, if you play it in a large group, it's where you take a sentence and you tell it to the person in the back, and they have to tell it to their neighbor, and they have to tell it to the person beside them, and it comes all the way back to the front, and by then, it's been whispered in everybody's ear, and everyone has heard it, and it's been twisted into something maybe completely different. It's like playing a game of telephone. The story of the Minoan civilizations could have been twisted over time, and to the priest Sanchez could have been the story of Atlantis. So that's theory 2, that Atlantis could have been a twisted story and history of the island of Crete and the civilization of the Minoans. Now, the third theory, which is actually surprisingly possible, is that Atlantis existed. So after all this research I did, Atlantis could still actually be real. Now, it's a little far-fetched than all of the other theories, but I've made a timeline. So, the Great Flood of Noah's Day, which destroyed the whole giant continent that was originally on the earth, split it into multiple parts. But we know that after the flood, everyone was supposed to disperse. So if the flood was in 2348, which that's the date I got from Answers in Genesis. So if the flood was in 2348, and we know that the Tower of Babel was a couple to half, like 150 years after the flood, the Tower of Babel was. And that's where God confused all of the languages of the people of the world, and that made them disperse even more. So there could have been a group of people that got on boats and headed to an island that was essentially in the North Atlantic, and that was Atlantis. Now, let's say it was in 2200 BC. There was no idea of writing at all then. There was no way you could keep track of dates or anything like that. The invention of writing was not invented by the Sumerians until 2000 BC. So if Atlantis was made in 2200 and writing was invented in 2000, Atlantis could have been real, could have taken over a lot of cities, could have had a huge empire, could have been very, very advanced, and they had writings of their own that they never shared with anyone. They never shared their inventions, and they were very advanced civilizations that was destroyed by a catastrophic event. Now, here's where the far-fetched idea comes in. This catastrophic event completely covered Atlantis was essentially like a mud hill, which got rid of all evidence and making Atlantis part of the ocean itself, meaning that we couldn't collect any artifacts from it at all, and there were no records of Atlantis because writing hadn't been invented. So the theory and idea that Atlantis could have been real is very possible, and it could have been real between 2200 and 2000 BC, between the Tower of Babel and the creation of writing. So, we have our three theories. Sanchez made up the idea of Atlantis. Sanchez misinterpreted the history of the Minoan civilization, or Atlantis was real, and we don't have any records of it because writing was invented, and it was completely covered by a mud hill and is still in the ocean, covered by what is basically the ocean floor. We don't even realize that it is Atlantis. Now, which one of these do I believe? Here's the hard question. Now, me saying this is the hard question is very true, because it is. All of these are very excellent theories that I've come up with, and they are all essentially proven. Sanchez could have most definitely been delusional and created the myth of Atlantis, or Sanchez definitely could have misinterpreted, for many reasons, the civilization of the Minoans. And Atlantis could have also been real, which would have been cool, but it's also very unlikely that it was completely demolished by a tsunami or a catastrophic event that could have covered it forever. So I think that's the theory that I'm going to eliminate first. Yes, writing couldn't have been invented then, but I don't think a whole civilization the size of this could have been demolished with no evidence at all. Yes, it was around 4,000 years ago. Yes, it could have been a large storm that covered it, but I think that historians and archaeologists have been looking for Atlantis for hundreds of years, and the North Atlantic would have been the main place they would have started looking. And I think they could have assumed that it could have been a mud hill. I don't think that Atlantis could have been completely covered with no evidence at all. I'm sorry, but Atlantis could have not been real in the way that Plato described it. So, now that we have that one eliminated, we have the idea that Sanchez made up the story, or Sanchez misinterpreted the idea of the Minoan civilization. I think he misinterpreted the idea of the Minoan civilization because it was around at the same time period that could have been way long off ago on the Egyptians' part. the Egyptians could have easily misinterpreted the idea of the Minoan civilization, because think of all of the similarities between Atlantis and Minoa. I mean, is that what you can call it? Minoan? Let's just call it that. The civilization of Minoa is much like Atlantis. It was on the large island of Crete, which Atlantis was also on a large island. It was a very long time ago, which is what Santos described it as. It was very advanced and it flourished, which is also very true. We found a lot of artifacts from the Minoan civilization, and their main idol, or so-called mascot, was the bull, which symbolized strength and power, and they could have taken over many series and acted as an imperial force. And another thing to think about is the island of Thera, which had the volcano that is actually still around today. This volcano erupted and totally burnt the city of Minoa, and earthquakes also shook Minoa badly, and the city was totally demolished in like a week. And that is very similar to Atlantis being destroyed in a single day. All these facts are very, very similar to the things that Plato says about Atlantis in the dialogues of Critias and Timaeus. So, my final conclusion that I have researched and that I've come to is that the priest Santos of Sais misinterpreted the history of the Minoan civilization, and that the Minoan civilization was from 2000 BC to 1450 BC. So Atlantis wasn't real. In my opinion, it wasn't. Now, if someone were to come along and bring new evidence of the Lost City of Atlantis, or come up with another theory, and if it's credible, I would take a hard look, and if it was better than my theory, I would go with it. But a lot of people that think they find artifacts of Atlantis really just found evidence of the Minoan civilization with the idol of the bull and how many artifacts of the advanced civilization that it was. So I believe that it was the Minoan civilization. Essentially, to sum it up, Atlantis was Minoa in the Mediterranean and on the island of Crete. Now, to sum it up, I think Atlantis has been a huge topic for mankind in pop culture, in just humans' love for mystery and civilizations, and I have a special interest for that as well. Even going into this, I love the idea of Atlantis always, and I think finding these artifacts that are thousands of years old is super cool. Just to think that specific men thousands of years ago made these things with their own hands, and that we still have standing structures and civilizations of people that are way long gone. So this is a really cool idea that humans have been interested in a very long time, and rightly so. Plato a lot of his writings are history in a way, and Plato's idea of Atlantis was taken seriously to some people, and he gave us a lot of info about it, which made us come to the conclusion that we did. But to mankind, finding Atlantis would be like winning the ultimate Easter egg hunt. I mean, the first time I heard about Atlantis was, in that old show DuckTales I believe it was in the 90s, the Disney show DuckTales, and they found Atlantis. Everything was completely wrong. Atlantis could not have been as small as it was in the DuckTales show, but that's not important. The fact is, even small children know about Atlantis. Everyone has heard about Atlantis at some time, and it's been a huge thing for man since. But like I said, this was one of my favorite episodes. Maybe not my favorite. Like, I have some top favorites, but this is definitely one of them. But thanks for listening, guys. We do have an email from our faithful listener and one of our biggest listeners. She's a Patreon VIP member, Michelle Hoover, and she sent me some episode topics by email. She said, name brand versus off-brand. Every time I think of name brand versus off-brand, I personally think of cereal. because you have like the off-brand Cinnamon Toast Crunch that tastes like cardboard from Kroger, and then you have the good Cinnamon Toast Crunch, and it's not the same. My mom thinks it is, but off-brand versus real brand cereal, it's not the same, frankly. I wish it was because it's cheaper, but it's not. And Disneyland versus Disney World. I have been to Disneyland, but I have not been to Disney World. So before we do this topic, I need to go to Disney World. And she also gave the idea of, did we really land on the moon? And I really, really want to do that episode topic, but I don't want to do it by myself or with someone who just agrees with me. I want someone who doesn't believe in it, so we can have a good discussion on what they believe versus what I believe, and then we can reminisce about that topic. But another one she gave was church music, and I think she assumes what it is today versus what it essentially should be in some people's opinions. That can be a very interesting theory, or not a theory. I'm into Atlantis too much. Been on it for the last 30 minutes. But it could be an interesting topic to see what it's become and what it should be according to the Bible. And the last one she gave was, should we eliminate daylight savings? And I think it's a good idea. It's partly annoying, and we get daylight changes throughout the year, so we don't need to change it and mess it up. It's also complicated for some parts of the world because some parts don't do it. And actually, I think Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy talking about it. And I think Trump was too. But I don't think it'll happen in years that are very close to it. But anything can happen. But thank you, Michelle Hoover, for emailing in. We also have a merchandise release. I didn't talk about it in the last episode last Monday, but it was released on March 15th. You can now go to the Jack Atwood Podcast Etsy store and get a Jack Atwood Podcast mug. It just says Jack Atwood Podcast, has the Patreon in it. I would love for you to check it out. And if you are a Patreon member, you get a special 20% off code. But make sure to go to Etsy.com. There'll be a link in the description of this episode for it, and you can check out the mug there. It's $10 plus shipping. So I tried to keep the price down as much as I could, I promise. But, profits are profits. Business is business. Make sure to join the Patreon so you can get that special 20% off. The first tier is $1 a month, which you get exclusive content and polls and discounts. But if you get the podcast VIP, which is now $2 a month, I lowered it from $2.50, and you get behind the scenes content and special episodes, and those episodes have been a huge hype, and there have been a lot of activity on those. Make sure to check out the Patreon there. And another thing, try emailing in if you have any sort of episode topic. I'd love to hear it. Maybe it can get in some polls. This idea and episode of Atlantis was originally an episode topic email idea, like I said, from Ava. So it can happen. If you have an episode topic or just want to email in, say hi, I will read it on the show. Email in, be a part of the community. Make sure to check out the Facebook page of the podcast. We're posting every week there. And make sure to also check out the merch once again. Big announcement on that. Thank you for listening, everyone. I know this was an interesting and exciting episode. Intriguing. But we'll see you next Monday. See you on the other side.